The moment my son Marcus gripped my arm, the air seemed to tighten around us. His fingers dug into my wrist so sharply I could feel every bone, every tendon strain beneath my skin. He looked at me with eyes that once held warmth, now wild with something I barely recognized. "Give me your pension," he screamed, his voice a jagged mix of anger and entitlement. The words hit me harder than any blow could have. I flinched, trying to pull my arm free, but he wouldn't let go. Then came the words that cut even deeper. "You've always been a burden to this family." For a moment, the room felt frozen. The silence that followed was heavier than the shouts. I had raised this man. I had nurtured him, fed him, and held him when the world seemed too cruel. And now, in my own living room, he was demanding my security, my small independence, as though it were his right to take it. He believed the money made him powerful. He didn't know the authorities already had his name. He didn't know the steps I had quietly taken, the precautions, the allies standing by, waiting for the right moment. The sounds of our struggle, the thump of my chair against the carpet, his harsh breathing, my own rapid pulse, filled the room, but outside, the world went on, unaware. It was just another ordinary morning, yet nothing about it felt ordinary. I could see the expectation in Marcus' eyes. He thought I would bend, that I would hand over my pension without question, that I would allow the betrayal to continue without resistance. He had grown up with a sense of entitlement, nurtured by every compromise I had ever made for him. And now, he demanded the final concession. But there was a quiet calculation behind my fear. My hands, though shaking, were not empty of defense. My mind, racing, knew things he did not. The police had traced his lies, his schemes, the manipulations he believed were hidden. Their arrival had been imminent, though not for me, not yet. That knowledge was both a comfort and a weight, a reminder that justice does not always move at the speed of fear. I wondered how it had come to this. How a mother's love, once the safest harbor in a child's life, could be met with greed and aggression. How a son I had raised with patience and care could turn on me with such violence and entitlement. And in that moment, gripping my arm, shouting over the furniture and the air between us, Marcus became both the crisis and the mystery I had to survive. The questions surged inside me, relentless. How does a mother endure when the very person she nurtured seeks to harm her? How do you stand firm when the lines between love and exploitation are erased by greed? And in the quiet tension before the storm, I realized the answers would not come from words or pleading. They would come from action, timing, and the knowledge that someone watching, unseen, had already begun to intervene. If this happened in your family, would you see it coming? Subscribe now. At 7 to 7, I had learned the rhythm of a life lived simply but with purpose. My days were no longer filled with the whirlwind of raising children or keeping a household alive with constant motion. Instead, they moved at a slower, steadier pace. Tea in the morning, a walk to the garden when the weather allowed, afternoons spent reading letters from old friends or tending to the small tasks that gave me a sense of control. It was a modest existence, far from grand or extravagant, but it was mine, and I valued the quiet dignity it brought. My husband, Harold, had passed years earlier, leaving me not only with memories but with a home that had been ours together. It was more than bricks and mortar. It was a place where laughter had echoed, where arguments had been made and resolved, where every corner held a memory of shared life. That house was my anchor, a testament to a life built with care, love, and persistence. While my pension provided the means to maintain it, it also offered me a degree of independence that I treasured. Losing it, or having it threatened, felt like a violation deeper than any theft could reach. I was not wealthy, nor had I ever been. There were no vacations in far-off lands, no luxurious dinners with silver cutlery. I had managed with practicality and foresight, saving what little I could, spending thoughtfully, making sure that my life was sustainable even as the world outside shifted unpredictably. I took pride in that. My finances were modest, but they were steady, and that steadiness gave me a quiet confidence. I was self-sufficient, respected by those who knew me, and careful to live within the limits I had set for myself. That sense of stability was the result of years of effort, discipline, and patience. My neighbors knew me as the woman who greeted them on morning walks, who shared her garden's produce, who always had a kind word for someone struggling. In the local community, I had a reputation for honesty and reliability. I was, in small ways, the backbone of my circle, offering advice, listening to worries, lending an ear without judgment. And yet, even with this network of people who valued and respected me, the betrayal I would soon face came from within the walls I had built for safety and comfort, the very place I trusted most. My days had once been filled with simple joys. A cup of tea by the window while watching the morning light hit the garden, the hum of birds outside, letters from Harold tucked carefully in a drawer I opened only occasionally. I cherished these moments because they represented not just routine, but continuity. The sense that life, even with its losses, continued to have order. I had no need for the trappings of wealth. I had built a life in which modesty and thoughtfulness were rewards in themselves. And then Marcus came. My son, the child I had raised with devotion, who had once clung to my hand with trust and warmth, became a figure of tension and fear in the same rooms that had once held our laughter. The home I had nurtured, the pension I had managed carefully, the legacy Harold and I had created together, all of it was suddenly under threat. My heart ached not merely at the thought of losing material security, but at the realization that the foundation of trust and family loyalty I had taken for granted was being tested in a way I had never imagined. Every small act of independence, paying a bill, deciding when and how to spend my day, walking the garden at dawn, became a quiet assertion of dignity. It was in these moments I reminded myself why I had worked to maintain control, why I had insisted on living within my means, and why I had kept my affairs orderly. Each step, each decision, was part of a fragile balance, and Marcus' aggression threatened to topple it all. Even as fear crept in, there was a steadying sense of resolve. I had endured loss before, and I had learned that the strength to protect oneself and one's dignity was not always loud or confrontational. Sometimes it was quiet, deliberate, and careful. I understood now that the life I had built, my home, my pension, my independence, was worth guarding. And though Marcus' demands shook me in that moment, I knew that surrendering to fear would mean surrendering the very essence of the life I had fought to maintain. We build lives quietly. That phrase had guided me more than I realized. It was not about grandeur or recognition. It was about sustaining the integrity of daily life, about making choices that preserve autonomy and dignity, about facing challenges with measured thought and steady courage. And as I prepared to confront the chaos Marcus brought into my home, that quiet principle became my anchor. I would not be broken, and I would not be erased. My life, modest though it was, had value beyond any measure of money or fleeting authority. Marcus had always carried a restlessness that never seemed to settle. From the moment he left school, he chased ambition with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He wanted more than what he had been given, more than the modest upbringing my husband Harold and I had provided. It wasn't just about success, it was about appearances, about projecting an image that suggested a life far grander than the one he truly led. The first time I began to notice the cracks, I attributed them to inexperience. He tried one business after another, some failed spectacularly, others quietly stumbled without drawing attention. Each venture came with a new promise, a new excuse for why the previous effort hadn't worked out. "It's temporary, Mom," he would say, eyes wide with conviction, as if simply stating the intention would make it true. I wanted to believe him. I still wanted to believe him, even as doubts began to creep in. Behind his confident exterior, though, was a web of hidden debts. Bills that went unpaid, creditors that called in silence, loans that were never mentioned in conversation, all stacked carefully out of sight. He had learned early to present a polished front, the kind that impressed friends and neighbors, masked by charm and casual laughter. It was a performance, one he performed so convincingly that even those closest to him often overlooked the warning signs. Marriage to Leona added a new layer of pressure. She came from a family that valued status, appearances, and financial success, and Marcus felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him. He tried to maintain a lifestyle beyond his means, keeping up with a social circle that didn't tolerate failure. The house he rented, the car he drove, the vacations he boasted about on social media, They were all carefully curated illusions meant to signal prosperity. None of it reflected the reality behind the curtain. The anxiety of unpaid bills, the constant scramble to make ends meet, the tension that grew with every month the facade had to be maintained. At first, I defended him. A mother always sees the best in her child. I rationalized his choices, offered quiet encouragement, and reminded myself that ambition sometimes comes with stumbles. I told myself that Marcus would learn, that he would find his footing if given the chance. But even as I encouraged him, a small knot of unease formed in my chest. I noticed the way he sometimes glanced at me, as if measuring my patience and endurance. I caught fleeting moments where frustration flickered across his features when I questioned his decisions or hinted that he might need to rethink his approach. I began to understand that ambition, unchecked by responsibility or conscience, can become a force capable of consuming everything around it. Marcus' desire for wealth wasn't tempered by ethics, by empathy, or by the lessons Harold and I had tried to instill. It was raw, insistent, and increasingly impatient. Each failed venture didn't teach humility. It sharpened his hunger, made him more restless, more willing to push boundaries, including those that once protected me. Even as my worry grew, I still saw traces of the son I had raised. The boy who had clutched my hand after a fall, who had cried when scraped knees met my lap, who had smiled with unguarded joy at the simplest pleasures. Those memories kept me tethered, made me hesitant to acknowledge the full scope of the threat he now posed. I wanted to believe redemption was possible, that love could override greed, that he could be guided back to reason. But the tension was mounting. Every phone call from a creditor that he didn't mention, every sudden visit with a vague excuse, every subtle jab about money became a reminder that the gap between the image he projected and the reality he lived was growing, and it was dangerous. I could see how easily it could escalate, how quickly ambition untethered from morality could spill over into confrontation. The worry I had dismissed as ordinary concern began to feel like a warning. At the heart of it, the story of Marcus was one many could relate to. Children, even grown adults, can become entangled in desires that cloud judgment. Parents, even the most careful, can find themselves in situations where love collides with the need for protection. It was a moral tension that weighed heavily on me, wanting to defend my child while knowing I had to set limits, wanting to preserve a bond while safeguarding my home, my independence, and my peace of mind. Every interaction became a delicate balancing act. I could feel the energy of Marcus' ambition pressing against me, testing boundaries I had long relied on. I had to watch carefully, speak carefully, act carefully. And yet, the same fire that made him restless, ambitious, and determined also made him unpredictable, capable of escalation at the moment he felt cornered or denied. It was a struggle between loyalty and self-preservation, between maternal instinct and the need to protect what was rightfully mine. I understood now that defending Marcus in the past had been necessary, but it had also allowed him to believe that limits were negotiable, that boundaries were suggestions rather than firm lines. The moment of reckoning, I realized, was inevitable. His ambition, unchecked and untempered, would sooner or later clash with my insistence on maintaining my life, my home, and my dignity. And as I watched him navigate the world, striving to keep appearances, to chase wealth, and to satisfy the pressures of marriage and social expectation, I began to prepare for the moment when support would no longer be an option, and standing firm would be the only choice left. At first, Marcus' requests seemed innocent, even reasonable. He asked for small loans, money to cover a temporary setback, he said, the kind of things a mother might naturally provide without question. I told myself that helping him was part of the bond we shared, that supporting a child in need was what families did. I handed him a few bills, and he smiled with gratitude that seemed genuine. I remember thinking, perhaps this time, he would manage things responsibly. But the pattern emerged quickly. Each loan became larger, each request more urgent. The word temporary no longer applied. I began to notice a shift. What was once casual help started feeling like expectation, and the expectation soon felt like demand. Marcus' visits grew more frequent, each one accompanied by subtle reminders of what I owed him, what he needed now. I felt a tightening in my chest every time he appeared at the doorway, polite greetings replaced by his eyes scanning the house, calculating. Promises were broken with astonishing regularity. Marcus swore he would repay what he borrowed. He insisted that this time he would manage things differently. And yet, every promise dissolved into excuses, each one more elaborate than the last. He was never dishonest with intention. He simply seemed incapable of following through. I tried to remind myself that habits could be changed, that my son was not inherently cruel. But the weight of repeated disappointment began to erode my patience, my confidence in him, and, most frighteningly, my sense of safety in my own home. Leona, his wife, added a new layer of pressure. Her remarks were subtle, almost casual, yet sharp. A comment about how I could easily spare a little more, a quiet observation about my savings, a fleeting question about whether I truly needed certain comforts. I felt her eyes, sometimes scanning the room, noting what could be accessed, what could be leveraged. It was not overt aggression, but the implication hung in the air, heavy and insistent. Between the two of them, the space I had cherished as my own began to feel contested. Visits no longer carried the warmth of family connection. They became transactional, revolving entirely around Marcus' needs and Leona's reminders. Conversations drifted quickly to money, obligations, or what I could provide. The stories I had once shared about my garden, about Harold, about my life beyond their world, those were no longer interesting or necessary. Every interaction felt calculated, each smile or word a tool to elicit compliance. I caught myself flinching when the doorbell rang, aware that another demand, another moment of subtle coercion, awaited me on the other side. Worse, Marcus began to appraise more than just my willingness to lend. His eyes lingered on my furniture, my small collection of family mementos, the places where important documents were kept. I noticed him scanning my home with a quiet intensity, cataloging the things he had once respected, now viewing them as potential resources to exploit. Even my pension, once a source of independence, had become a target in his mind, an untapped reserve of power. The gradual shift from help to entitlement to outright exploitation was insidious. One moment, I had been a mother extending assistance. The next, I was a resource to be mined, my life assessed in terms of how it could serve their ambitions. I began to see the difference between generosity and exploitation, and the realization was chilling. The love I had given, the care I had taken to raise my son, was being used against me, twisted into a justification for his repeated invasions of my trust. It was during one of these visits, as Marcus leaned casually against the doorway, counting out an excuse for why yet another payment was urgent, that I realized something fundamental. I was no longer being asked for help. I was being measured, evaluated, and pushed. Every conversation, every glance, every remark from Leona chipped away at the boundaries I had set, testing how far I would allow intrusion into my life. And each time I had caved, even slightly, it encouraged the next push, the next escalation. I began to ask myself the question that would haunt my days and nights. When does help become exploitation? The answer, I feared, was arriving too late, but the recognition of it gave me clarity. I could see the pattern now, the relentless progression from request to demand, from casual expectation to entitlement, from subtle coercion to outright manipulation. And I knew that to preserve what was mine, my independence, my dignity, my sense of safety, I would need to confront it, to set firm boundaries, and to face the consequences of doing so. By the time Marcus left that day, the air in my house felt heavy with tension. I could no longer ignore the change that had taken place, the dynamic that had shifted from mutual respect to a struggle for control. The home I had loved, the sanctuary I had maintained, now carried the weight of his ambition and disregard. And in that quiet, uneasy aftermath, I realized that the next step could not be taken lightly. Help had turned into obligation, generosity had turned into leverage, and the small loans I had given had grown into a test of my resolve. The moment I finally said no, the air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with a tension I had never felt before. Marcus had come once again, his hand outstretched for the latest emergency that, in his mind, required my pension. I had counted the repeated promises, the countless excuses, the constant weighing of my life against his needs. My heart pounded, my palms pressed into my lap, but my voice did not waver when I said firmly, "No, Marcus. I cannot give you this." For a heartbeat, he froze, as if my words had struck a physical barrier he could not penetrate. Then the shift came. His eyes darkened, and the air between us seemed to crack. What had once been negotiations, subtle coercion, or polite requests exploded into anger. He leaned toward me, words cutting like knives. "You're impossible. You've always been selfish. You think only of yourself." The accusations tumbled over one another, reckless and bitter. When verbal attacks failed to bend me, Marcus' frustration manifested physically. His grip on my arm tightened in a way that left bruises forming almost immediately, and the chair I had been sitting in scraped harshly against the floor as he forced me to shift uncomfortably. I could feel the strain of his impatience and anger, the raw expectation that my compliance should be automatic. I drew in a steadying breath, refusing to let fear dictate my response. I would not give in. The dynamic that had defined our relationship for years splintered in that moment. Where he had once seen a mother who might negotiate, someone to persuade or manipulate with charm, he now saw an obstacle. I had become the problem, the one standing in the way of his ambitions and entitlement. The roles reversed subtly but definitively. I was no longer the passive participant in our interactions. My refusal had shifted the balance, even if only slightly, and Marcus could not accept it. His anger roared louder, and the room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as if the house itself had taken notice of the fracture between us. Every syllable he spoke was sharpened by expectation denied, every gesture amplified by a sense of entitlement he had nurtured for years. I recognized the pattern of escalation. I had seen hints of it in previous interactions, but nothing prepared me for this intensity. Where there had been tension, now there was confrontation. Where there had been subtle pressure, now there was open hostility. Even as fear coursed through me, I recognized the strength I had not allowed myself to claim before. Saying no was not just a refusal of a financial demand. It was an assertion of self, a claim to dignity, a boundary drawn firmly in the ground. Marcus' reaction, violent and unrestrained, underscored the necessity of this stance. My resistance, though it sparked his anger, was a declaration that I would no longer be treated as a resource to be exploited. Leona's presence added fuel to the fire. She remained in the background, her gaze calculating, ready with a sharp word or a reminder of how inconvenient my stance was. She had perfected the subtle insinuation that I was overreacting, that I was unreasonable, that Marcus' behavior was justified by need. Together, they sought to frame me as irrational, as a mother who had somehow lost perspective. Their words, though pointed and deliberate, did not intimidate me. They only clarified the reality of the situation. The family unit I had known had fractured, and I now stood at the center of its tension. The silence that followed my refusal was as loud as their words had been. Marcus retreated momentarily, a storm simmering in his eyes, while I steadied myself in my chair. My pulse slowed, though my hands shook slightly from the adrenaline. I realized that the act of saying no had shifted the entire framework of our relationship. Where he had once dictated terms with a casual expectation, I had demonstrated that I, too, had control. My autonomy, long overlooked or tested, had been declared. I understood then that this was only the beginning. The refusal had provoked him, yes, but it had also revealed the truth about our interactions over the years. That I had allowed concessions that now encouraged entitlement, that the very love I had shown had been twisted into leverage, and that my silence had been mistaken for agreement. My refusal was not simply a denial of funds. It was a reclamation of authority over my life, my home, and my decisions. As Marcus stormed out, slamming the door behind him, I felt the weight of the confrontation settle in the air. It was a heavy, charged silence that spoke louder than any words could. The fracture was visible, undeniable, but so was my resolve. I would not be coerced. I would not be pushed into submission. My life, my pension, and my dignity were mine to protect. And as the echo of the door's slam faded, I understood something critical. Saying no was not the end of the struggle. It was the first step toward reclaiming what had always belonged to me. In that moment, I realized the complexity of what lay ahead. Marcus would not relent easily. Leona would continue to apply pressure in subtle ways. And the trust one had extended over decades would be tested like never before. But the emotional pivot had occurred. I had asserted myself, drawn a line, and shifted the balance of power. The fracture of trust was real, yes, but it was also the fracture that made change possible. The first moment where I could defend my independence, my safety, and the life I had spent years building. After Marcus' outburst, the atmosphere in my home felt different, heavier in ways that were difficult to describe. Even when he wasn't present, his shadow seemed to linger, amplified by Leona's presence and subtle manipulations. Where once visits had been transactions, now the exchanges carried a quiet but insistent pressure, one that seeped into every corner of my routine, every decision I made. I began to feel that my home, my sanctuary, was no longer mine. Leona, in particular, seemed to thrive in these moments of tension. She would ask questions in such a casual, almost innocent tone, yet each one carried an undercurrent of doubt about me. "Are you sure you remembered that correctly?" she asked once, tilting her head, a small smile playing at her lips, as if my recollection of an event might be flawed. Another time, she suggested, almost jokingly, that I might be mistaken about a payment or a bill. It was subtle, persistent, and unsettling. The sort of manipulation that wears down confidence slowly, leaving one questioning their own judgment. I found myself hesitating before speaking, analyzing my words for flaws or inconsistencies. Every response felt scrutinized, every decision a potential point of criticism. Even small actions, paying a bill, signing a form, placing an item on the counter, suddenly carried weight I had not felt before. Leona's comments were like tiny fractures in a wall I had built around my independence. They were quiet, almost imperceptible, yet powerful enough to create unease where there had once been certainty. The requests soon became more structured, more insistent. A casual suggestion about combining accounts, a joint bank account, was presented as a convenience for family management. Power of attorney, she argued, would only make things easier if something happened to me. To an outsider, her tone might have seemed reasonable, even caring. To me, however, it felt like an invasion, a quiet attempt to wrest control from my hands. Every explanation she offered, every smile or word of reassurance, felt calculated, designed to normalize her influence while minimizing my autonomy. I began to feel the weight of isolation. Conversations with Marcus and Leona were laced with undertones that made speaking with anyone else feel futile. Friends, neighbors, even my own instincts seemed overshadowed by the subtle pressure and insinuations from the two of them. I caught myself holding back, second-guessing myself, wondering if I was overreacting or misremembering events. Their manipulation was not loud or obvious. It was measured, psychological, the kind that slowly erodes confidence without drawing attention to itself. The documents I had carefully maintained, the papers detailing my finances, my pension statements, letters from institutions, and Harold's old legal papers, suddenly felt vulnerable. I began hiding them in drawers, locking certain files away, tucking envelopes in books, anything to preserve the control that was slipping from my grasp. The act of securing these items became ritualistic, almost desperate, yet it also offered a small sense of reclaiming agency. The knowledge that they could not easily access my affairs provided a fragile layer of protection, a shield against the quiet erosion of my independence. Even routine tasks became tests of vigilance. Opening the mail required attention to ensure nothing was missing or redirected. Checking my bank accounts became a ritual of careful observation. Every interaction with Marcus or Leona was analyzed for ulterior motives, every tone of voice dissected for hidden meanings. It was exhausting, isolating, and terrifying in ways I had never experienced before. My home, once a place of safety and routine, had become a landscape of subtle traps and constant vigilance. There were moments when I felt my own perception faltering. Did I really hear Leona suggest joint accounts? Had Marcus' tone really carried that sharp edge? The unease and subtle fear seeped into my bones, making me question whether my instincts were reliable. I realized that psychological abuse does not always shout. It whispers, it insinuates, it bends your sense of reality until you doubt your own memory, your own judgment. And that, I understood, was the most dangerous part. It isolates you, not by force, but by subtle erosion of confidence. I began to document everything, quietly, carefully. Every conversation, every suggestion, every instance where I felt my autonomy challenged. The act of recording these moments became a lifeline, a way to maintain clarity when the world around me felt deliberately clouded. Yet even as I did this, I could not escape the loneliness that settled in the corners of the house. No one outside our family could fully grasp the subtlety of what was happening, and inside, the perpetrators of the manipulation acted as if their intentions were normal, benign, even helpful. I discovered, in those days, how exhausting vigilance can be. Simple acts, like making tea, organizing bills, or opening the mailbox, became exercises in defense. Every gesture carried weight. Every word was scrutinized before it left my mouth. The tension in my home was constant, a slow, creeping pressure that tested my resolve, my patience, and my endurance. I felt trapped in a space that should have been my own, forced to navigate a minefield of subtle coercion and psychological games. Yet amid this unease, I also found a flicker of determination. I realized that while Marcus and Leona could attempt to manipulate, they could not take my mind, my memory, or my judgment from me entirely. Every document I secured, every instance I quietly resisted, was a small act of preservation. I understood that the path forward required patience, strategy, and a clear mind. To give in to fear or confusion would mean surrendering control over the life I had carefully maintained. It became clear that psychological abuse is not always violent or loud. It can be slow, insidious, and devastating precisely because it is invisible to the casual observer. It erodes confidence, isolates the target, and cultivates self-doubt. For me, it was a daily battle, a quiet struggle for autonomy, for clarity, for the simple right to manage my own affairs without interference. I came to understand that preparation was essential. I could not rely solely on instinct or goodwill. I needed allies, documentation, and careful observation. Every small act of hiding a document, noting a remark, or standing firm against a suggestion was part of a larger strategy to protect myself, my independence, and my dignity. And while the loneliness and subtle fear persisted, they also sharpened my awareness, my resolve, and my readiness for the confrontation that I knew would eventually come. It was Simon, my neighbor, who first noticed the tension in my home. He had lived next door for decades, a quiet presence who tended his garden and exchanged polite greetings each morning. We had shared small moments over the years, a borrowed cup of sugar, discussions about the weather, the occasional laugh, but I never imagined he would become one of the people who would help me navigate the storm Marcus and Leona had created. Yet, there he was, one afternoon, leaning slightly over the fence with a concerned expression I could not ignore. "Evelyn, I don't mean to pry," he began carefully, his voice low and measured, "but I've noticed the way Marcus speaks to you. It doesn't seem right. You look tense, frightened even, when he's around." His words were simple, almost understated, yet they cut through the fog I had been living under. For years, I had questioned my own perceptions, wondering if I was overreacting, imagining patterns where none existed. Hearing someone else acknowledge the tension gave me a flicker of relief, a small validation that my instincts were not misplaced. It was Simon's quiet concern that prompted me to reach out to Darlene, an old friend and trusted lawyer I had known for more than 20 years. Darlene was practical, no nonsense, and fiercely protective of those she cared about. When I explained the situation, Marcus' escalating demands, the subtle pressure from Leona, the small but persistent erosion of my autonomy, she listened intently, nodding occasionally, making brief notes. Then, in that calm, deliberate way that always reassured me, she said, "Evelyn, you need to start documenting everything. Every visit, every request, every remark that makes you feel pressured or unsafe. It may feel tedious, but it's your safeguard." Her advice was precise and actionable. Darlene explained that documenting these patterns was not just about preparing for legal intervention. It was about reclaiming clarity in a situation designed to confuse and destabilize me. Each note, each photograph, each record of interaction would serve as proof of the behavior I had endured, proof I could use to protect myself and assert control over my own life. She emphasized that doing this was not betrayal, it was self-preservation. Even with Simon's concern and Darlene's guidance, I felt conflicted. Marcus was my son. The thought of reporting him, of taking steps that might place him in legal jeopardy, twisted my stomach into knots. Could a mother truly do that to her own child? I wrestled with the morality of it, questioning my intentions, my love, and my responsibility. Every time I weighed the risks, the memories of his outbursts returned. The gripping of my arm, the harsh words, the sense that my home was no longer mine. And in those memories, the answer became painfully clear. Protecting myself was not betrayal. Protecting my dignity and my life was necessary. The presence of allies changed the energy around me. Simon's casual but attentive check-ins, Darlene's calm expertise, their shared acknowledgement that I was not imagining the situation. It all provided a sense of relief that had been absent for far too long. I realized that I no longer needed to face this alone. Having people who understood the subtlety of psychological pressure, who validated my experiences, gave me a small but significant sense of empowerment. It was no longer just fear and unease. It was clarity and readiness. I began taking the first steps carefully, methodically, as Darlene had suggested. I created a journal to record Marcus and Leona's actions and words, noting dates, times, and the context of each incident. I took photographs of documents and any correspondence that demonstrated their manipulations or demands. I even began creating a small, hidden file cabinet to store important papers and evidence safely. Each action, though small, was a deliberate reclaiming of control, a quiet act of resistance in a situation designed to make me feel powerless. At first, these steps felt mechanical, almost surreal. I would record a detail of a conversation and pause, wondering if I was overthinking or exaggerating. But each entry, each note, strengthened my resolve. I could see patterns emerging, the gradual but unmistakable escalation of entitlement and pressure. And with every entry, the weight of doubt lifted slightly. I was not imagining things. The tension, the manipulation, the subtle coercion, they were real, and I was documenting them to preserve my autonomy. There was also an emotional shift I could feel deep in my chest. The relief of knowing I had allies, combined with the clarity provided by documentation, allowed me to reclaim some of the peace I had thought lost. Where fear had dominated, a cautious hope began to take root. I could see the path forward, not entirely clear but defined enough to guide my steps. The combination of awareness, preparation, and support gave me the courage to face the coming challenges with a sense of quiet determination. Of course, the decision to act remained complicated. Marcus was still my son, and the thought of confrontation, of formal reports or police involvement, caused tension to coil in my stomach. I knew that the road ahead would not be smooth, that there would be resistance, anger, and perhaps attempts to intimidate or manipulate further. Yet the presence of Simon and Darlene reminded me that I was not isolated, that my perception of events was accurate, and that I had every right to defend myself and my home. In those weeks, I began to notice subtle changes in my own behavior. I spoke more firmly, answered questions without hesitation, and no longer allowed small remarks or pressures to unsettle me. I set boundaries, quietly but clearly, and recorded instances when they were challenged. Each act of preparation became a thread of control in the fabric of my life, strengthening my position and giving me the confidence to act when the moment required it. Ultimately, the appearance of allies was more than just practical assistance. It was emotional support, validation, and the quiet reassurance that I was not alone in facing the challenges Marcus and Leona presented. With Simon watching for signs of aggression and Darlene guiding me through documentation and strategy, I began to feel empowered for the first time in months. The fear and isolation, though not entirely gone, were now tempered by a clear plan and the knowledge that I had people who believed in me, trusted my instincts, and would stand with me if the confrontation escalated. And so, even as I debated the moral and emotional implications of reporting my own son, I felt a growing certainty. Protection of oneself, one's dignity, and one's home was not betrayal. It was necessary. It was right. And with the support of those who truly understood, I could face the next steps with clarity, courage, and careful strategy. The day Marcus arrived, the air in my home felt electric, as if every corner was holding its breath. I had anticipated tension before, had braced myself for the subtle pressures, the psychological manipulations, the financial demands, but nothing prepared me for the desperation in his eyes that morning. He stormed through the front door without knocking, the weight of entitlement in every step. The familiar warmth of my house, once a place of peace and quiet reflection, now felt like a battleground. "Mom," he barked, voice sharp, cutting through the quiet. "Where's the money? I need it now." The casual urgency that had marked previous requests had vanished. It was replaced by raw insistence, a storm that demanded immediate compliance. His eyes darted around the living room, scanning the furniture, the photographs, the modest decorations that Harold and I had cherished. Each glance felt intrusive, like he was evaluating everything as if it belonged not to me, but to him. I stood my ground, gripping the edge of the sofa to steady myself. "Marcus," I said firmly, "I've told you before. I cannot give you more." My voice was calm, but beneath it, my heart raced. I knew this moment would be different. I could feel the shift in the air, the tension stretching tight like a cord ready to snap. His response was immediate. He stepped closer, his presence imposing, his temper flaring. "You don't understand," he shouted, leaning toward me, voice rising with frustration. "You think this is about money? It's not enough. Mom, you're holding me back." His hand shot out, gripping my arm. The pressure was sudden, painful, and electrifying in its intensity. I flinched but did not release my stance. Every instinct screamed to recoil, but I could not allow fear to dominate. The words followed the grip, "You're a burden to this family." He spat them out as if they were truth itself. The insult cut deeper than the physical grasp, a verbal wound that lingered in the space between us. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The room, the house, the life I had built, it all hung in the balance, fragile, tested by his aggression. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. My breath came in shallow bursts as I measured every movement, every word. The clash of authority and desperation, of entitlement and autonomy, filled the room with tension. Marcus' anger was unrestrained, a tidal wave crashing against the boundaries I had so carefully constructed. And yet, in the middle of it, I felt a strange clarity. This confrontation, as frightening as it was, would define the next chapter of my life. I could not back down. His eyes scanned the room again, lingering on objects I had come to protect. My documents, the small amounts of money I had tucked away, even Harold's old photographs. Each glance was a reminder of the stakes, a calculated move to assert dominance, to test the limits of my resistance. I felt a surge of indignation, a quiet but resolute refusal to surrender. "Marcus," I said, voice stronger now, "I am not giving in. This ends here." The tension escalated further. His hand tightened briefly on my wrist, then released, but the anger in his eyes had not abated. He began pacing, back and forth across the living room, muttering under his breath, each phrase a mixture of frustration and entitlement. The atmosphere felt charged with every movement, every gesture, every word. My body remained still, a quiet anchor against the storm, but inside, adrenaline surged. Then came the final act before silence fell. He leaned close again, voice sharp and accusing, "You've always been a burden. You don't get it. You're the problem." The words reverberated through the room, leaving me momentarily shaken. I could feel the weight of the insult, but I did not let it break me. My gaze met his, steady and unwavering. I understood then that power was not always in aggression. It was in endurance, in remaining unshaken, in holding firm when chaos demanded surrender. And just like that, he left. The door slammed behind him with finality, the sound echoing through the house long after his footsteps faded. The tension remained, but now it was mine to control. I sank into the nearest chair, breathing deeply, allowing the silence to settle over me. The storm had passed, but its imprint lingered, the bruises on my arm, the echo of his words, the lingering awareness that this confrontation was only one of many battles, yet it marked a turning point. I noticed the way the room itself seemed to exhale. The sofa, the windows, the corners of the living room, the familiar textures and shapes now carried a weight of renewed vigilance. I could almost feel the house responding to the confrontation, standing with me, a silent ally. Each object, each corner, each memory within these walls was part of what I was protecting, what I would continue to safeguard with unwavering determination. The short, sharp moments of confrontation contrasted with the slow, deliberate silence afterward. Each short sentence Marcus had shouted, each quick motion of his hand, left its mark. And in the quiet that followed, the gravity of the encounter sank in. I understood clearly the depth of the threat, the persistence of entitlement, and the necessity of preparation, documentation, and strategic action. I also felt the first flicker of empowerment. Standing firm had shifted something. It was subtle, but undeniable. I had asserted control in a moment where he had expected compliance. That evening, I reflected on the encounter. The physical pain from the grab would fade, but the lesson it brought remained vivid. Power is not always derived from force. It can be reclaimed in moments of stillness, in clarity, in resolute refusal. Marcus had acted with the intensity of desperation, but I had met him with the strength of preparation, of purpose, and of self-preservation. Every bruise, every harsh word, every glance was a testament to the tension that had built over years of entitlement and subtle coercion. But it also marked the moment where that pattern could finally be challenged. And as night fell, the house returned to its familiar rhythm. The gentle ticking of the clock, the muted hum of the heater, the faint whisper of wind outside the windows. Marcus was gone, but the echo of his presence lingered. I knew he might return, that the struggle was far from over. Yet in the silence, I also recognized that the balance had shifted. I had faced aggression directly, with measured resolve, and survived. I had claimed, in that confrontation, a space that was mine, a moment of authority that no amount of anger could diminish. In the quiet, I allowed myself a small, steadying breath. The confrontation was over, for now, but the preparation, the vigilance, and the awareness I had cultivated over months, through subtle intimidation, psychological manipulation, and persistent demands, had finally crystallized into readiness. The house was mine again, if only for the moment, and I could plan my next steps with clarity. The storm had broken, and though it might return, I now had the strength, insight, and allies to face it. After the confrontation with Marcus, I knew things could no longer remain as they had been. The anger, the physical grab, and the verbal insult had left more than just temporary bruises. They had left a clear reminder that my home, my life, and my independence were at risk. It was time to act, to move from defense to decisive action, and to ensure that the pattern of aggression, manipulation, and entitlement would not continue unchecked. I reached for the phone and called Simon first. His calm, steady voice on the other end was a small comfort. "Simon," I began, my own voice trembling slightly but firm. "I need you." "Marcus, it's getting worse. I can't handle it alone." Simon listened, asking a few clarifying questions, his tone a mixture of concern and determination. He understood the gravity immediately, without judgment, without hesitation. He promised to come over, to help me document, and to be a witness to the escalating behavior that had begun quietly but had now exploded into confrontation. Next, I contacted Evelyn. Even from the moment I described the most recent incident, she recognized the seriousness of the situation. "Evelyn," she said, "it's time to treat this with the same seriousness as any legal matter. This is not about punishment for Marcus, it's about protection for you. You need a record, and you need a plan." Her words resonated deeply. For years, I had wavered between doubt and fear, questioning whether I was overreacting. But now, with guidance and validation, the path forward became clear. Documentation, proof, and formal reporting. Together with Simon and Evelyn, I began the meticulous, but necessary, process of creating a record of Marcus' actions. Every visit, every demand, every insult, every moment of physical aggression was noted carefully. Dates, Times, words spoken, actions taken, all entered into a journal that would serve as an accurate, indisputable account. I also began photographing letters, text messages, and any evidence of financial coercion. Every detail was recorded, every piece of information a step toward reclaiming control and ensuring my safety. The act of documenting was surprisingly empowering. Where I had felt fear, uncertainty, and isolation for months, I now felt a sense of agency. Each photograph, each written entry, was a small victory, a way to reclaim power that had been challenged but not entirely lost. The process also helped me frame the incidents clearly in my own mind, separating facts from emotion, observation from speculation. For the first time in a long time, I could see the situation as it truly was. Marcus' entitlement, Leona's subtle pressure, and the ongoing erosion of my autonomy. As I prepared the records, Darlene guided me through the steps for a police report. I was hesitant at first. After all, Marcus was my son. Would authorities understand the nuance, the subtlety of psychological manipulation intertwined with aggressive demands? But Darlene reassured me, the law does not require a victim to remain passive, and documentation of repeated behavior, especially physical aggression or coercion, is taken seriously. It was not betrayal, it was protection. Simon helped take photographs of any items that had been mishandled, letters that contained demands, and areas of the house where tension had been most acute. His presence was reassuring, practical, and non-judgmental. He reminded me to remain calm and precise, to avoid exaggeration, and to focus on facts. Together, we compiled a clear and organized record of incidents. It was a quiet, deliberate act, but it carried the weight of months of tension, fear, and subtle intimidation. Finally, the report was filed. Sitting across from the officer, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. I recounted the most recent confrontation, detailed the physical contact, the words spoken, the pattern of behavior that had escalated over time. Each sentence was precise, measured, deliberate. The documentation I had prepared allowed me to speak with clarity and authority, ensuring that my account would be taken seriously. It was no longer just a collection of memories, of fear, or of doubt. It was evidence, a shield against continued abuse, a formal step toward protection. Filing the report was not easy. Part of me still wrestled with the moral weight of reporting my own child. But as I left the station, a sense of resolve settled over me. The act of taking legal steps was not about vengeance. It was about safety, dignity, and reclaiming a home that had been overshadowed by coercion. I had finally transformed fear into action, uncertainty into clarity, and vulnerability into preparation. In the days that followed, I maintained the documentation, adding notes for each interaction, no matter how minor. Every call, every message, every visit was recorded with precision. The act of vigilance became routine, but it was a routine rooted in empowerment rather than fear. I could see patterns emerging, connections becoming clear, and the narrative that had seemed chaotic was now coherent. The power dynamic, once heavily weighted in favor of Marcus and Leona, began to shift. I was no longer passive. I was active, aware, and deliberate. This turning point, the moment I decided to document, to report, and to act, was also a moment of clarity. I realized how many families might endure similar patterns silently, how entitlement and subtle manipulation often go unchecked until escalation occurs. It is easy to dismiss small actions as temporary, innocent, or harmless, but patterns matter. They reveal themselves over time, and they demand recognition and response before harm becomes entrenched. By taking action, I reclaimed not only my safety but also my dignity. I had proven, to myself most of all, that boundaries matter, that autonomy is not negotiable, and that standing firm in the face of aggression is both necessary and justifiable. It was a lesson in resilience, in courage, and in the quiet strength that can emerge when fear is transformed into deliberate action. And for those watching, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of recognizing warning signs early. Entitlement, repeated coercion, subtle manipulation, or aggressive behavior may start small, but patterns escalate. Protecting yourself is not betrayal. Speaking up is not disloyalty. And documenting incidents, consulting trusted allies, and involving authorities when necessary is not only wise, it can be life-changing. CTA number 2, most families ignore warning signs. Subscribe so you don't. By the time I finished the reporting process, I felt a weight lifted, a tension released that I had carried silently for far too long. Marcus' behavior no longer held the power it once had over me. The house, once a space of tension, had become a site of preparation and clarity. I had transformed fear into action, manipulation into documented evidence, and isolation into connection with trusted allies. The struggle was far from over, but the first decisive steps had been taken, and with them came the knowledge that I was not powerless. After filing the police report and documenting every incident, I expected the world to shift immediately, to feel the relief of justice moving quickly. But life has its own rhythm, and the wheels of authority turn slowly, deliberately, quietly. I had to wait, and waiting in the shadow of uncertainty proved almost as tense as facing Marcus directly. I had prepared for confrontation, but I had not anticipated the mental strain of anticipation, the knowledge that action was being taken, yet invisible to those who had caused harm. The first formal measure came in the form of a temporary restraining order. The papers arrived discreetly, slipped under my door with a silence that matched the careful planning of the authorities. It was brief, official, and precise. Marcus was to have no contact with me, my home, or my property. Reading those words, I felt a surge of relief, tempered by the awareness that this was only the first step. The paper was small, but its significance was enormous. It represented the legal acknowledgement of his behavior and, in that acknowledgement, a layer of protection I had not experienced before. Alongside the restraining order came the involvement of Adult Protective Services. Their arrival was calm, professional, and unassuming. The agents spoke with measured concern, asking questions, taking notes, and carefully assessing the situation. They examined the documentation I had prepared, photographs, journal entries, and other evidence of Marcus' escalating aggression. Unlike the chaos of his visits, their presence was quiet, methodical, and reassuring. The contrast between the storm of entitlement and the calm of authority was almost surreal. For the first time in months, I felt the quiet reassurance that my home was beginning to be a space of protection again. I found myself waiting in a unique state of tension. Marcus had no knowledge of the steps being taken, no sense of the preparations quietly unfolding behind the scenes. Every knock at the door, every sound in the hallway, every shadow passing by a window made me hold my breath, half expecting him to appear and disrupt the fragile sense of order. Yet each passing hour reinforced a growing certainty. The authorities were acting deliberately, carefully, and effectively. His ignorance of the measures taken against him was my secret advantage, and I clung to it, a quiet shield of strategy and protection. This period of waiting revealed how much control Marcus had assumed over my life without ever needing formal authority. The tension that had once been constant, visible in gestures, in words, in subtle manipulations, was now suspended in quiet uncertainty. I understood the irony. He believed he could pressure, intimidate, and manipulate me with impunity, yet he was entirely unaware that steps had already been taken to prevent further harm. In that gap between expectation and reality, I found a strange form of satisfaction, tempered with caution. Each day passed in measured observation. I maintained my journal, adding small notes about interactions, reminders about documents, and minor incidents that still occurred despite the distance Marcus was required to keep. Even in restraint, patterns of behavior could appear. Phone calls ignored or hung up abruptly, attempts at subtle influence through friends or associates, and occasional, indirect messages that tested my resolve. Every instance reinforced the importance of thorough documentation and careful planning. I also noticed subtle shifts in myself. Whereas before I had been reactive, responding to outbursts, defending my dignity in real time, I now moved with purpose and patience. Each action, each decision, was measured against the growing framework of legal and personal protection I had assembled. The restraining order and APS involvement were not just paperwork. They were tools that allowed me to regain the mental and emotional space Marcus had encroached upon. I felt increasingly grounded, more certain of my own clarity, and less susceptible to intimidation. The silence in the house became almost palpable, but in a way that was different from the fear-filled quiet of previous months. It was a strategic calm, a waiting period filled with purpose and preparation. I would sit in my chair, hands folded, listening to the soft hum of the heater, the distant birdsong, the occasional rustle of leaves outside the window. In that quiet, I felt the tension of previous confrontations ease slightly, replaced by the knowledge that my preparation was working. Marcus' ignorance of these actions became a constant reminder. The balance of power was shifting, even if subtly, and each day of patient waiting strengthened my position. Curiosity and anticipation intertwined. I imagined the moment when Marcus would eventually learn that his assumptions about control and power were false, that the quiet, methodical steps I had taken, supported by authorities and allies, had created a barrier he could not penetrate. The thought was both reassuring and tense. The confrontation had not yet occurred, yet the inevitability of accountability loomed closer each day. He believed I was powerless, yet the truth was the opposite. My actions, deliberate and carefully executed, had transformed fear into protection, coercion into legal consequence, and uncertainty into preparation. Throughout this period, I reflected on the broader lesson. Sometimes protection does not require immediate confrontation, loud action, or visible resistance. Sometimes it requires patience, observation, and strategic alignment with those equipped to enforce boundaries. The restraining order and APS involvement were tools that worked quietly, without spectacle, but with profound impact. They reminded me that power is not only in assertive defiance, it is also in planning, documentation, and trust in proper channels. The combination of legal measures and careful preparation provided a growing sense of security. Marcus' ignorance of these interventions created a temporary advantage, one that allowed me to consolidate control, document every eventuality, and maintain vigilance without the immediate threat of escalation. The tension in the home remained, but it was now tempered by strategy, clarity, and the quiet knowledge that he no longer had unchecked influence over my life. In that quiet, I began to plan the next steps. Each day of waiting reinforced the necessity of continued documentation, careful observation, and patient collaboration with authorities. The process of legal intervention was not instantaneous, but it was deliberate in a way that protected me while allowing the system to act effectively. Marcus' assumptions, his sense of control, were entirely misplaced. He thought I was powerless. The truth, of course, was far different. The morning started like any other, quiet and unassuming. The sun casting soft light across the garden and the familiar hum of neighborhood life settling into routine. I was in the kitchen, preparing my tea, when a sudden commotion outside made me freeze. The sound of engines, low but purposeful, cut through the calm of the morning. I stepped to the window and saw a marked police cruiser slowly turning onto our street. My heart skipped a beat, a mix of apprehension and curiosity. I watched, silent, as the officers approached. Something felt different in the air, not just the usual tension, but a sense of finality. Neighbors, who often went about their routines with polite smiles and brief nods, were now leaning out of windows, stepping onto porches, quietly observing. There was a collective hush, a shared anticipation that something significant was unfolding. I remained inside, blending into the background, my hands folded around the warm cup, waiting. The officers did not approach my door. Instead, they moved with precision, heading down the street, past our house, and stopping at a location I recognized immediately, Marcus' residence. My stomach tightened, the culmination of months of tension, fear, and preparation now reaching its inevitable point. I could see the realization flicker across his face as the officers stepped out of the cruiser, authoritative and deliberate. For once, his confidence, his sense of power, faltered. He tried to retreat, words tumbling out in disbelief and protest, but the officers were calm, professional, and unyielding. Handcuffs appeared almost as an afterthought, closing around his wrists with a finality that made my chest tighten and my pulse quicken. I observed the moment with an intensity that was almost surreal. Marcus' eyes met mine briefly across the street. In that instant, a silent exchange passed between us. Recognition, shock, disbelief, and perhaps a flicker of regret. The air between us was heavy, yet charged with resolution. Neighbors remained on the sidelines, silent witnesses to the event, their quiet attention amplifying the significance of the moment. I noticed their expressions shift as the reality of Marcus' actions became clear. There was no cheering, no celebration, only the shared acknowledgement that justice had arrived, that the abuse and manipulation, long endured in silence, had finally been confronted. The scene was stark, the simplicity of procedure highlighting the gravity of the situation. The law had acted, decisively and quietly, catching Marcus completely off guard. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, tempered by the complexity of emotion. This was not vindication in the way one might imagine from stories of revenge. It was something quieter, deeper, and far more satisfying. Months of tension, subtle coercion, and outright aggression had culminated in a moment where right was enforced, where accountability was tangible, and where the manipulation that had haunted my home could no longer continue unchecked. The handcuffs, the measured calm of the officers, the silence of the neighbors, all of it crystallized into clarity. Marcus had believed he could act with impunity, that my home, my possessions, and my autonomy could be challenged without consequence. And yet, in this moment, it became abundantly clear that assumption had been false. His sense of entitlement, nurtured over years of unchallenged behavior, had collided with the reality of preparation, documentation, and law enforcement. The contrast was striking, a silent testament to the power of foresight and action. I allowed myself to breathe fully for the first time in months, the tension that had resided in my chest beginning to ease. The officers spoke quietly among themselves, guiding Marcus to the vehicle, ensuring the process was orderly, controlled, and unambiguous. Marcus' protests diminished as the reality settled in, his earlier aggression replaced by confusion and the dawning awareness that he was not in control. The neighborhood had witnessed a shift in balance, but it was measured, discreet, and just, the kind of resolution that resonated deeply because it had been earned through patience, evidence, and careful planning rather than impulsive action. As I watched the cruiser pull away, Marcus inside, handcuffed and subdued, a mixture of emotions stirred within me. Relief, vindication, and a quiet sense of triumph rooted not in vengeance, but in protection. I realized that the months of careful observation, recording, and legal preparation had created this moment. The justice was not theatrical, not loud, not grandiose. It was deliberate, calm, and profoundly effective. Marcus' shock, the abrupt loss of his assumed power, underscored the consequences of his actions in a way that was immediate and undeniable. I looked around at the neighbors who had silently observed. Their expressions mirrored my own internal relief and satisfaction. The acknowledgement that right had been served, that the abuse and aggression that had once gone unchecked were now addressed. There was no cheering, no spectacle, only the quiet understanding that months of tension and subtle manipulation had been met with measured, definitive action. It was a moment of clarity, of moral resolution, and of emotional release that words alone cannot convey. The house felt different afterward. The oppressive tension that had weighed so heavily in previous months seemed lighter, almost tangible in its absence. I moved through the rooms slowly, noticing the ordinary, familiar details, the framed photographs, the old sofa, the small knickknacks that had survived years of careful attention, and felt a renewed sense of ownership over my space. For the first time in months, I did not flinch at sounds, voices, or shadows. My home, my life, and my dignity had been defended, not by confrontation alone, but by the combination of strategy, documentation, and legal authority. In that quiet aftermath, I reflected on the nature of justice. True justice is often measured, deliberate, and quietly effective. It does not always require loud declarations or public spectacle. It requires patience, preparation, and clarity of purpose. Watching Marcus caught off guard, handcuffed, and escorted away, I understood that the power of foresight, the discipline of careful documentation, and the courage to act when necessary had created a moment that was both morally and emotionally satisfying. The day marked a turning point. Marcus' actions were met with consequences, the pattern of manipulation interrupted, and the threat to my home and independence effectively neutralized. I did not feel triumph in anger, but in the quiet acknowledgement that right had been restored, that patience and preparation had prevailed, and that months of subtle coercion could not withstand deliberate action. The silence that followed, the calm in the neighborhood, and the sense of moral clarity were profound in their own understated way. And as I sat quietly in the living room, the echoes of Marcus' shocked realization still lingering in my mind, I allowed myself to embrace a simple truth. Justice, when pursued with clarity, preparation, and support, arrives when it is meant to. It may not always be loud, dramatic, or immediate, but when it does arrive, it carries weight, impact, and the satisfaction of knowing that right has been defended, and that wrong has been held accountable. The day after Marcus was taken into custody, the house felt unusually quiet. The usual hum of activity, the small creaks in the floorboards, the soft whispers of the wind through the trees, seemed to carry a deeper sense of calm, a subtle reassurance that the tension which had dominated my life for months was easing. I moved slowly through the rooms, noting the ordinary details I had almost forgotten to appreciate. The worn edges of the sofa cushions, the photographs lining the walls, the small clock ticking softly on the mantel. Everything felt intact, undisturbed by the chaos that had recently unfolded. Simon was the first to arrive that morning. He entered without ceremony, a simple presence that brought immediate comfort. We sat together in the living room, sipping tea in the quiet, a wordless acknowledgement passing between us. His support was steady, practical, and genuine. He understood that this was not a moment for celebration, not a moment for triumphal gestures or dramatic expressions of relief. Instead, it was a moment to breathe, to process, and to allow the gravity of the situation to settle. Darlene arrived shortly after, carrying a folder with detailed notes and documentation. She had reviewed the case, confirmed that the charges against Marcus were clear, and outlined what would happen next. The language she used was straightforward and deliberate, avoiding unnecessary legal jargon while ensuring I understood the implications fully. "Evelyn," she said calmly, "the charges are primarily for coercion, intimidation, and attempts to unlawfully access your property and funds. There is evidence of repeated incidents, including physical aggression and financial pressure. The authorities will proceed methodically, but the documentation you provided ensures that your account is credible, verifiable, and enforceable." Hearing her explanation brought a sense of clarity I had not felt in months. The legal consequences were now tangible, yet they were framed in a way that emphasized protection rather than punishment. Marcus would face accountability, yes, but the focus remained on safeguarding my independence, my home, and my dignity. It was not revenge. It was justice in its most deliberate form, measured and precise. We spent the morning reviewing each piece of documentation I had prepared, confirming that every detail was accounted for. Darlene highlighted how my records, photos, and notes had provided an indisputable narrative of events. Simon assisted in organizing the materials, ensuring that nothing was misplaced or overlooked. The process, though quiet and methodical, carried a profound sense of resolution. Months of fear, tension, and subtle manipulation had been transformed into a structured, evidence-based approach that allowed me to regain control over my life. Even as the legal framework was established, I found myself reflecting on the emotional impact of recent events. There was relief, certainly, a release of the constant anxiety that had shadowed my days. Yet that relief was tempered by the gravity of what had transpired. Marcus was my son, after all, and no matter the wrongs committed, the relationship could not be erased entirely. The recognition of betrayal was coupled with a cautious understanding of human complexity, the ways in which entitlement, fear, and ambition can distort behavior. The presence of Simon and Darlene was grounding in every sense. Their quiet support reminded me that I was not alone, that the measures taken were not only legal but also moral and necessary. I could feel the tension in my shoulders gradually ease as we worked through the final steps of preparation and clarification. There was no fanfare, no loud declaration of victory. Instead, there was peace, a deliberate calm that came from knowing the proper channels had been engaged and that protection had been established. Later, I walked through the house alone, observing the familiar spaces with renewed appreciation. The kitchen, where I had once felt anxious about small disturbances, now felt like a place of safety. The living room, where Marcus had confronted me, seemed to breathe with a quiet resilience, its corners holding the echo of past tension but now tempered by clarity and preparation. I realized that peace does not require celebration. It requires presence, awareness, and the quiet knowledge that boundaries are enforced and respected. As the day continued, I reflected on the lessons embedded in this chapter of my life. Independence is fragile, dignity is precious, and boundaries are not optional, they are essential. Protecting oneself may feel uncomfortable or morally complex, particularly when family is involved, but it is necessary. The work of months, documenting, preparing, observing, and acting, had created a structure that ensured safety, accountability, and control. It was not dramatic or theatrical. It was deliberate, quiet, and effective. Even with Marcus now facing legal consequences, life did not shift immediately back to normal. There was a lingering awareness of vulnerability, a reminder that preparation and vigilance are ongoing. Yet in that awareness was also strength. I had learned to trust my instincts, to act decisively when necessary, and to rely on the support of those who truly understood the situation. Simon and Darlene exemplified the power of allies, people who validate experience, offer practical guidance, and provide emotional steadiness without judgment. In the evening, I sat in my favorite chair by the window, holding my cup of tea and watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. The tension that had once dominated my thoughts had softened, replaced by a sense of control and clarity. The house was quiet, the world outside continued its rhythm, and I felt the peace that comes not from celebration, but from knowing that one's dignity, independence, and safety had been reclaimed. It was a simple, profound understanding. Justice need not be loud to be effective. The consequences for Marcus were clear, the boundaries established, and the house, my sanctuary, once again a place where I could live without fear. Relief did not manifest as joy or triumph. It manifested as calm, steadiness, and the quiet acknowledgement that the right actions had been taken at the right time. And in that quiet, I understood that the true measure of resolution is not in applause or recognition, but in the calm that follows clarity, the assurance that one is safe, and the knowledge that preparation, courage, and deliberate action can transform fear into protection. The months of tension, subtle coercion, and emotional strain had culminated in a moment of measured justice, one that restored not only my security but also my dignity. As the dust settled and my home regained its quiet rhythm, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. Months of tension, subtle coercion, and outright aggression had tested not just my patience, but my sense of self, my dignity, and my understanding of family. In facing Marcus' actions and taking the necessary steps to protect myself, I realized a truth that resonates far beyond any single confrontation. Protection is not betrayal. Choosing safety and asserting boundaries is not an act of disloyalty. It is an affirmation of one's worth, one's dignity, and one's right to live without fear or manipulation. For years, I had wavered. I questioned myself, wondering if reporting my own son or taking legal measures was too harsh, too final, too disruptive to the fragile bonds of family. There were moments when guilt crept in, subtle and insistent, asking if love required silence, if care demanded tolerance of aggression. But the events of recent months illuminated the reality. Silence and tolerance in the face of harm are far more damaging than firm, measured action. True care for oneself, and even for those who have strayed from respect, requires courage, the courage to uphold boundaries, to insist on dignity, and to act when necessary. In protecting myself, I discovered a quiet strength I had not fully recognized. It was not the kind of power that demands attention or provokes fear. It was the steady, enduring resolve that allows a person to maintain clarity in the midst of chaos, to act decisively when intuition and reason align, and to uphold principles even when the path is uncomfortable. This strength is subtle, often invisible, yet profoundly effective. It manifests in measured decisions, deliberate preparation, and the unwavering commitment to safeguard one's life and values. Boundaries emerged as the most critical lesson of all. Respecting others begins with respect for oneself, and when others violate that respect, it becomes necessary to reinforce limits. Marcus' repeated demands and attempts to intimidate were not just challenges to my authority. They were violations of trust, dignity, and autonomy. By establishing clear, enforceable boundaries, I was not only protecting myself. I was defining the terms of interaction for the future, showing that accountability and respect are non-negotiable. Boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are frameworks for safety, clarity, and meaningful connection. The experience also reinforced the importance of allies. Simon and Darlene provided support that was practical, emotional, and grounding. Their guidance reminded me that facing challenges does not require isolation, and that seeking assistance is a reflection of wisdom, not weakness. Protection is strengthened by awareness, preparation, and collaboration, and the presence of trustworthy allies transforms fear into confidence and vulnerability into resilience. As I reflect, I also recognize the broader lesson for anyone watching. Families, by their very nature, are complex, filled with competing needs, expectations, and emotional entanglements. It is easy to allow guilt, habit, or misplaced loyalty to cloud judgment, to tolerate disrespect or coercion under the guise of love. Yet true respect, for oneself and for the relationships one wishes to preserve, requires discernment. Choosing safety and dignity is not betrayal. It is an investment in the integrity of both oneself and the family unit. Now, as my home rests in quiet peace, and as I move forward with clarity and calm, I invite viewers to consider a question for themselves. When does loyalty require courage, and when does silence become complicity? How do we honor family bonds while maintaining self-respect and boundaries? These are not simple questions, and there are no universal answers, but reflection is the first step toward wisdom. For anyone who has experienced manipulation, aggression, or subtle coercion from loved ones, know this. Your strength is valid, your boundaries are essential, and your right to protection is unquestionable. Standing firm may feel difficult, uncomfortable, or even lonely, but it is the path to preserving dignity, clarity, and peace. There is empowerment in preparation, in deliberate action, and in trusting your instincts when they signal harm. I encourage viewers to share their perspectives. How would you respond if someone close to you repeatedly crossed boundaries? What steps would you take to protect yourself while honoring relationships? Comment below to reflect on the moral choice, the challenge of boundaries, and the ways we can balance love with self-respect. Your insights may help others navigate similar struggles, and your reflections contribute to a dialogue about courage, protection, and quiet strength within families. In the end, the lesson is simple but profound. Protection is not betrayal. Quiet strength, clear boundaries, and self-respect are the pillars that sustain dignity in the face of challenge. Standing firm may not always be easy, but it is always necessary. And in that necessity lies freedom, the freedom to live without fear, with clarity, and with the assurance that right, reason, and courage can prevail, even in the most complicated of family dynamics.